Okay, America and the Holocaust. The Holocaust, again, is the systematic extermination, right, of European Jews during World War II, in addition to other, right, undesirables according to the Nazis. So we know that about 6 million European Jews will lose their lives in the Holocaust. There was an additional 6 million gypsies, homosexuals, communists, Slavs, right, and other people. The term genocide is created in an effort to kind of explain what the Holocaust was by the end of the war during the Nuremberg trials. How do we actually get there? In 1938, we know that the Nazis have been persecuting Jews for a long time, and we discussed the event known as Kristallnacht. And this actually led to a refugee crisis in Europe, right, where a lot of Jews, right, from the Third Reich were desperate to just leave the country to get out. And the Evian Conference is called for by FDR, and England, France, the United States, and Germany all meet together. And the Nazis pretty much put it on us. They're like, if you don't like what we're doing to these citizens who we don't want, you take them. And that led to a really hard moment where some countries took the Jews, but it wasn't like an open door policy. And we can clearly see that for the United States with the ship on the PowerPoint, the St. Louis. In 1939, this was a ship that departed France full of Jewish refugees seeking asylum. They tried to disembark in Cuba. Cuba wouldn't let them. And then they sailed up the American East Coast from Florida, hoping that the government would change its mind, right? The captain was desperate for FDR to kind of grant these people asylum, and FDR does not. And in 1939, the St. Louis sails back to France, and it's believed that more than 25% of the passengers on board died in the Holocaust. Why is that? America has a long history of anti-Semitism. We saw that with the resurgence of the new Klan, right, in the early 1900s. We've seen that with Charles Lindbergh and his anti-Semitic remarks in the America First Committee in the last chapter. And there is a sense in the United States that we need to remain neutral, right, in this growing war, and that if we bring in these European refugees, the Jewish refugees, they could threaten that, right, or they could be foreign spies and saboteurs. Also remember that there are some Americans that actually think fascism's great. There's an actual, basically, Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden in the 30s, right, with a swastika and a portrait of George Washington. So we're not immune to this, and it really is a dark moment when thinking about what would follow, right, with the Holocaust during the war. In 1942, we end up getting sort of the push for this thing, the Holocaust, known as the Final Solution, as a result of the Wannsee Conference, where German High Command got together and basically wanted to have a final solution to the Jewish question, right? We persecuted them, we rounded them up, we tried to get rid of them. By 1942, the Nazis have invaded so many countries, they just want a simple, answer, right, to how do we get rid of them. And basically, you have what's called the death camps, where they create a system of industrialized murder, where they're going to gas, right, Jews and other people, and then incinerate the remains in the crematoria. And this is a system that's put in place by 1942. When news starts coming out of this, right, we go from ghettos and concentration camps to actual death camps. The world doesn't necessarily believe it. They don't believe that people are capable of doing something quite this monstrous. And it is so shocking when the camps get liberated by war's end. Reels are taken of the liberation, and eventually all this evidence is put on the trials of Nuremberg. It really stuns the world, right, the scale of the Holocaust. This is a map showing us the extent of concentration camps under Nazi Germany, as well as the squares outlined in white of the death camps, mainly in Eastern Europe. All right, back in the United States, number one, World War II is going to end the Depression for the United States. Why is that? Well, number one, we need to produce more than we ever have, because this is going to be the greatest war really in modern history. America's fighting a two-front war, and it is believed that if we cannot produce the Axis powers, we will lose. That's a simple core belief of the U.S. government during this period that none of you should forget. Production is key to American victory. Another thing to keep in mind is that because it's a two-front war, we're going to take about 15 million men out of the workforce, right, to go fight and win the war. And that's huge. So what ends up happening is we actually have a labor shortage. Unemployment drops almost zero. And ironically, we pivot, right? In the Depression, when unemployment was so high, we actually deported, right, 500,000 Mexicans. And now by 1942, we're asking for Mexicans to come back, right, under this thing called the Braceros program, to work as guest workers, largely in agriculture, right, to maintain food supply, as well as other things we're doing. One big thing is we're going to have to reopen factories and actually build new ones, right? FDR is telling the military and the government that we need to make an insane number of planes and munitions and ships and all these different things that people initially think is impossible, but FDR asserts that it is possible. The American people can do it. We have to do it, right? If we're going to win, it's a crisis. What that means is a lot of these wartime industries are going to need unions, right? So union membership goes up throughout World War II, and a lot of factories have closed shop. Now, the exchange for that is that unions cannot go on strike. Again, they can't harm productivity. And one thing employers can't do is actually change wages. So there's wage controls, right? And what that means is a workaround, right? If I'm a factory owner during World War II, to make sure that my company's on a good footing when the war finally ends, is I'll start to offer employer-based health care, which is something that we're still talking about as Americans. That actually really picks up in World War II. So that's the key, right? We need to get everyone on the same page, and they have to be working, right? And following the Depression, American people want to work, especially now to win this war for the country. Stabilizing the boom. So we know the economy is going to grow, largely as a result of the war. The big question is, can we manage that growth so that the whole thing doesn't tumble, right? We don't have a bust. The government body really in charge of this is the OPA, the Office of Price Administration. If the civilian economy implodes, that means the military can't win. And so we don't want too much inflation. So there's going to be price controls, wage controls also, right? But also this thing called rationing, basically meaning that you're going to have to limit the supply of certain goods for citizens. The military needs meat, right? So that soldiers can have protein so they can keep fighting. That means that there's going to be restrictions on red meat. And there were actually booklets, right, issued by the government to citizens across the country where they had to go into a store and have the store owner basically sign off that they weren't cheating the system and overbuying, right, needed supply. We saw it in other ways too. Women, for instance, were encouraged to donate silk stockings to the government for parachutes. And this led to the development of nylon stockings, right? You also had people encouraged to grow some of their own food, right? Victory gardens to offset the demand for vegetables and fruit and stuff like that. Another big thing is mobilizing production, right? How do we actually get the things made quickly? The Office of War Mobilization oversees that, right? It gets the government to work with American companies, right, to produce what we need. This is clearly espoused by FDR as early as 1940 in the Arsenal of Democracy speech. I would encourage you guys to watch a fireside chat. And what that means is when we declare war, right, after Pearl Harbor, there will, for instance, be no new cars made for 4 years for civilians. Every automaker is making something for the military, whether it's ships or jeeps or tanks or whatever. So imagine that for 4 years, not a single new model of car anywhere in the United States. That's the extent of mobilization. This is a total war, right? The public is part of the war effort. If they're not, then we may not win, right? Production is key. And just to illustrate that, by 1944, American output is more than double that of all the Axis powers combined. So we are producing more than double everything Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan can produce by 1944. Part of that is how the war is going on over there, they're losing, but also just the insane sort of expansion of production we've had in the United States through the war. All right, so again, propaganda at home, right? Encouraging people to plant victory gardens, right? To do their part. This even happened in cities where communities would work together to take abandoned lots, right? To form community gardens. There is a sense that if you have a stake in it, right? If you have members of your family who at this time, almost every American family was touched by the war in some way, whether it was rationing, planting a victory garden, or likely having a husband, a son, a cousin, an uncle serving somewhere in the military, right, during this war. There is a sense that the entire nation has to be on the same page, right? We're all in this together. We all have to be focused on winning and doing our part. And this even extends to kids. Comics have been big in the 30s. You see the debut of a new hero in World War II called Captain America, right? First issue, literally punching Hitler in the face. Again, giving us some context of the time. And here are kids, again, doing their part to help with recycling, right? To go around their communities and pick up spare metal and tin and paper and rubber, right? for government recycling centers to do their part to help win the war. We have never seen a war like this since, where civilians are mobilized to such an extent in trying to help the government. Here are women working in an airplane factory, mass produce the conical noses of bombers in California. And what ends up happening is a big part of World War II is the rapid advancement of new weapons and technology in order to win it. And this was, again, a lesson of World War I. The National Defense Research Committee, which was headed by Vannevar Bush as early as 1940, was sort of kind of the first government body committed to this. And it evolves and will produce radar and sonar, right? But it also supports the research in this sort of real bleeding edge field of particle physics, right? Atomic energy research. And what ends up happening is that by 1942, this evolves into what we more commonly know as the Manhattan Project. And we cooperate in the field of atomic research with our British allies, right? And there was a lot of different individuals associated with the establishment ultimately of the Manhattan Project. Albert Einstein wrote a personal letter with Dr. Szilard to FDR, kind of trying to persuade and convince him that to take some of the wartime money and invest in this sort of bleeding edge field of physics research. And as early as 1938, scientists in labs in Nazi Germany, in Italy, here in the United States at universities are starting to detect something called atomic fission, right, and control experiments in labs. And Einstein and other scientists and physicists believe that this could actually have huge repercussions in the future in energy, but maybe if the research is accelerated, could be harnessed to help win the war, at least prevent the Axis powers, the bad guys, right, the Nazis from reaching it first. Very early days in 1941-42 for atomic energy. Radar and sonar are important because radar has the ability to detect airplanes, right, and bombers to protect cities and military installations. That is developed during World War II. Sonar is basically radar and water, to detect submarines, which is something that is seen as a huge advancement for the Allies. But the biggest thing by far that we hold a technical advantage in really early in the war, and we maintain it throughout, is aircraft superiority. The Allied powers, especially in the United States, are able to just outproduce our enemies by huge margins. So if they shoot down one plane, we have many more coming off the line. We start to sort of improve the training of our fighter pilots, our capacity of bomber planes. And so aircraft superiority is really key because if you control the skies, it makes it that much easier to attack by sea or land. It's very hard to flip that, right? To not control the skies and actually win on the ocean or on the ground. Another big technical advantage we had for the Allied powers, right, especially in the United States and England, was intelligence, right, which is basically it's basically the military term for knowing what your enemy is planning or doing without them realizing you know it. And that's pretty much, if you play cards, it's like looking at someone's hand without them knowing, right? It totally upsets the game, like poker or anything like that. And we luckily have a huge advantage in that. The Germans had something that was seen initially as an unbreakable coding system, this Enigma machine, that through something called Project Ultra, a very famous, or should be famous, British, let me go back, scientist, or Dr. Alan Turing, mathematician actually, is able to come up with essentially the first modern computer to break this unbreakable code. So we could start to figure out what the Germans were planning with their, coded messages. America achieved a similar victory with the purple code under Operation Magic. We break the Japanese code. So that's a huge advantage that was kept very hush-hush throughout the war, but in retrospect, really helped the Allied powers win a number of key battles over time. Okay, we'll stop there.